I had just finished brushing down the horses when I heard the sound of tires crunching on the gravel drive. It wasn't a delivery truck or a neighbor. No one around here showed up unannounced. I looked up and there they were, Grayson and Lily, standing outside my gate like ghosts from another life. Her belly heavy with pregnancy, a U-Haul behind them, no words at first, just tired faces and a kind of desperation you don't fake. I didn't say much. I just opened the gate slowly. Because if they were here, then something must have gone very, very wrong. And I already knew this time the rules would be mine. If you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're tuning in from. I never imagined that at 62 I'd be sleeping on a couch in my son's living room. It wasn't just any couch. It was one of those fold-outs with a metal bar that dug into your spine no matter how you positioned the mattress. The cushions smelled like Grayson's cologne and Lily's vanilla candles, a scent I now associated with humiliation. After 30 years of marriage, I'd left with nothing but 2 suitcases and a divorce decree that still felt warm from the lawyer's printer. Grayson called it temporary. That was the word he used when he offered me the couch. Just until you get on your feet, Mom. Temporary, like I was a shipment in transit. Not a woman who had raised him through fevers and heartbreak, scraped knees and report cards, graduation speeches and first jobs. Their apartment was modern and pristine, too pristine for someone like me. The hardwood floors weren't to be walked on with shoes, though no one ever said that aloud. I picked up on it from the way Lily winced when I came in from outside. The thermostat was off limits. The good towels in the linen closet were for guests, not for the mother-in-law who now hovered like a ghost on the edge of their picture-perfect life. Each morning began with routine and avoidance. Grayson's alarm buzzed precisely at 6:15. He'd shower dress in his tailored suit and eat cereal with almond milk while scrolling through his phone. Then came Lily, fresh from her 20-minute skincare routine, gliding through the apartment in heels and perfume, blending her protein smoothie like a woman untouched by inconvenience. I, on the other hand, waited. I waited for the bathroom to free up. Waited until they left for work so I could heat water in the microwave for instant coffee. Because the expensive espresso machine was apparently finicky, and only Lily knew how to use it. I washed my clothes by hand in the sink. Ate my meals cold, or from the microwave. I didn't leave dirty dishes in the sink, didn't use their condiments, didn't sit at the dining table. I made myself invisible because I sensed that was what they preferred. There were no arguments, no yelling, just silence padded with politeness that stung more than any raised voice. The way Lily said my full name, Caroline, instead of Mom. The way Grayson would nod instead of hug. The way they closed the bedroom door at night as if I carried something contagious. I kept my belongings tucked behind the entertainment center. My life reduced to 2 suitcases and a canvas tote. There were photos in that bag. Wedding pictures, baby pictures, snapshots of holidays and birthdays long past. Sometimes I would take them out late at night, long after the apartment had gone quiet, and stare at them, under the dim lamplight, wondering how things had unraveled so completely. One morning I got up earlier than usual. My back was aching and I hadn't really slept. I was making coffee. Instant, of course. When Grayson walked into the kitchen, his charcoal suit looked perfect against the pale walls, his tie neatly knotted like always. He blinked in surprise. "You're up early," he said. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, stirring the coffee that tasted more like regret than anything else. He hesitated for a moment, loosening his tie slightly. That old childhood habit. He always did that when he was about to say something he knew I wouldn't like. "Lily and I were talking," he began. "We think it might be time for you to start thinking about more permanent arrangements." I set the mug down a little harder than I meant to. "Permanent arrangements. You know," he said quickly, "like a senior living place. They have great programs, social stuff, meal plans. It could be really good for you." "Of course," I said, forcing a smile. "How silly of me. I thought maybe I could stay a bit longer." just until I figure things out." He sighed. "Mom, you know this was always supposed to be temporary. That word again, temporary." I wanted to say something, wanted to remind him of all the sacrifices, all the years I'd put my life on hold for him. But instead I said nothing. I just nodded as if agreeing with a meeting memo. Later that day I overheard them whispering in the bedroom. They weren't even trying to be discreet. Lily mentioned needing space for the nursery. Grayson said, "She'll understand. She's reasonable." I wasn't sure which stung more, the fact that they were pushing me out or that they thought I'd quietly accept it. That night at dinner, we barely spoke. Lily announced that her mother had found a new apartment. 3 bedrooms, she said. Granite counters. In-unit laundry. She said it like it was normal, like it was a thing one just had while I, her husband's mother, was sleeping on an old couch in her living room. The final blow came the next morning. Grayson was adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. I stood behind him trying to gather the courage to ask for just a few more weeks. Instead, he turned to me and said, "You know, Mom, if you wanted comfort, maybe you should have stayed married to Dad." It was a casual remark, offhand, but it hit like a punch. My ears rang. My vision blurred. For a moment, I just stood there stunned by how easily he reduced 3 decades of pain, betrayal, and effort into a single sentence. A sentence that erased my sacrifice, my heartbreak, my humanity. I didn't respond. I couldn't trust myself to speak without breaking. Later, when they left for work, I sat on the couch with my cold coffee and stared at the walls. I wasn't angry. Not yet. What I felt was deeper than anger. It was the kind of ache that doesn't scream. It settles like dust in the corners of your soul. I looked around the room I'd been haunting for 3 weeks, and for the first time I saw it clearly. I didn't belong here. I never had. That was the moment something shifted inside me. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I knew the next chapter of my life wouldn't be written from this couch. And I would never let anyone make me feel invisible again. The morning after Grayson's words, I woke up feeling like something inside me had calcified. It wasn't just sadness anymore, it was something firmer, something quieter and more resolved. I moved through their apartment as if I were made of glass. Transparent. Fragile. Easy to ignore. I cleaned up the blanket I had used, straightened the couch cushions, and made sure there wasn't a single sign that I had been there. It felt almost funny. How well I'd learned to disappear. How I could fade into the background of my own child's life. But underneath the silence, something else had started to hum. That afternoon, I walked to the corner market a few blocks away. It was a habit I'd picked up since moving in. A way to get out of the apartment without feeling like I was intruding. The shopkeeper, Mr. Patel, had gotten used to me by now. He always greeted me kindly, never asked questions, and rang up my small, careful purchases without judgment. 1 can of soup, a sleeve of crackers, a yogurt cup, never enough to fill the fridge, just enough to get through the day. That day I had a crumpled $10 bill in my hand. I had been saving it for bus fare or maybe gas money if I ever convinced Grayson to let me borrow the car again. But something pulled my eyes to the lottery tickets behind the counter. The Powerball jackpot was posted in bold red numbers, $3 million. I chuckled to myself. What a joke. People like me didn't win the lottery. But then again, people like me didn't end up sleeping on their son's couch either. "You feeling lucky today?" Mrs. Harris. Mr. Patel asked. It was a simple question, not salesmanship, not sarcasm, just curiosity. I looked down at the bill in my hand. $10, enough for 2 days' worth of groceries. Or a single chance at a different life. "Why not?" I said. He printed out a quick pick and handed it to me with my change. $8. I folded the ticket and tucked it into the back of my wallet right next to my expired credit card and the emergency contact form from my old doctor's office. 3 things equally useless in the world I lived in now. I returned to Grayson's apartment, made myself a mug of soup, and sat quietly through the evening flipping channels on the muted television. At 11:17 p.m. during a commercial break, the winning numbers scrolled across the bottom of the screen. I almost didn't look, but something made me glance down. 42. Powerball 18. I blinked. Then I blinked again. The numbers felt oddly familiar. I pulled the ticket out of my wallet hands, trembling slightly, and held it up to the screen. One by one, I compared them. Not once, though. Not twice. Over and over. Every single number matched. I couldn't breathe. The ticket fluttered to the floor as I collapsed back onto the couch, my heart pounding. I stared at the ceiling, at the shadows, at nothing. The silence roared in my ears. $3 million. After taxes, it would be less, but even half would be more than I'd ever imagined having. More than Grayson had in his retirement fund. More than Walter would ever voluntarily hand over in a settlement. I reached down and picked up the ticket, holding it in the light like it was made of gold. For a few minutes, I sat there frozen, unable to comprehend what this meant. Then the questions started to flood in. What now? Do I tell them? Do I say nothing? Do I cash it in and vanish? My mind raced with possibilities. My body was numb, but my heart was awake in a way it hadn't been in years. I thought of that morning of Grayson adjusting his tie and saying those words. You should have stayed married to Dad. I thought of Lily's polite disinterest, of the coffee maker I wasn't allowed to use, of the nights spent curled up on that sagging sofa with my knees tucked to my chest. And then I thought of all the years I had sacrificed, all the energy I had poured into being a good wife, a good mother, a good woman, only to be discarded like a piece of old furniture when I was no longer convenient. No more. I wouldn't be anyone's burden. I wouldn't wait around to be granted permission to exist. I had been given a gift. Yes, by chance, by luck, by fate, call it what you want, but I knew what to do with it. The next morning I woke before either of them stirred. I moved through the apartment with a calm I hadn't felt in weeks. I made my coffee quietly, packed my belongings even quieter. I didn't leave a note. I didn't slam the door. I just walked away. That lottery ticket stayed tucked deep inside my purse, sealed in a Ziploc bag next to my ID and the crumpled remnants of who I used to be. I walked to the bus stop, watched the sunrise over the quiet streets, and planned. For the first time in a long time, I planned not out of fear, but out of purpose. My life wasn't over. In fact, it had just begun. And no one, not Grayson, not Lily, not Walters, would get to write the next chapter but me. I didn't know where I was going yet. But I knew this: I would never sleep on another couch that wasn't mine. And I would never let anyone mistake my kindness for weakness again. The day after I won the lottery, I disappeared. Not dramatically, not with suitcases flung into the back of a cab or a slammed door echoing down the hall. Just quietly, intentionally. I checked into a modest extended-stay motel on the other side of town, under my maiden name. Paid cash, so turned off my phone. And for the first time in years, I let myself exhale. There was no celebration, no champagne or confetti. Just silence and the steady clicking of my fingers on a borrowed laptop as I began to plan. I knew one thing: if I was going to rebuild my life, I had to do it on my terms. That meant control, privacy, a new identity, not in name but in purpose. I started by forming an LLC, a consulting firm vague enough to avoid suspicion, yet believable enough to open doors. Caroline H. Consulting. I filed the paperwork myself at a government office downtown, dressed in the same plain clothes I'd worn for weeks. The clerk barely looked up. Another middle-aged woman starting a business. Nothing remarkable, but I felt remarkable. With the papers in hand, I opened a business account at a credit union and wired my lottery winnings into it through a maze of transfers and holding entities. I wasn't hiding the money. I was protecting it. From Walter, from the lawyers, from anyone who might question how a 62-year-old woman went from folding blankets on a sofa to owning property. And that was my next step. I'd spent countless hours online researching real estate. I wasn't interested in luxury condos or beachfront escapes. I didn't want to be pampered. I wanted space, freedom, purpose, something solid, something mine. That's when I found it. A 40-acre farm just outside a small town I'd never heard of. Rolling pastures, an old white farmhouse with peeling paint, a dilapidated barn, and a listing price far below its potential. The owners were settling an estate quickly. No inspections, cash preferred. I drove out the next morning in a rental car and met the agent, a nervous woman named Carol who kept checking her phone. "The place needs work," she warned as we walked across the cracked porch. "It's been empty for a while. I didn't care. I didn't need perfect. I needed a beginning." Inside the house smelled like dust and old linoleum. The kitchen was outdated. The floors creaked and the wallpaper curled at the edges. But the bones were good. The windows faced sunrise. The upstairs had 4 bedrooms. And in the back, down a gravel path, there was a small structure. A caretaker's cottage, Carol called it. 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, barely functional. It was perfect. "I'll take it," I said before she finished her sales pitch. She blinked. "You haven't even asked about the septic system. I'll take it. All cash, no contingencies." 3 days later, the deed was in my name. I drove back out with contracts, signed a tool belt I bought on impulse, and a notebook full of plans. I hired contractors to start with the essentials: plumbing, electrical, a new roof for the barn. The house could wait. I didn't need polished granite or fresh tile. I needed shelter and structure. I needed to make something useful with my own hands. The local hardware store became my second home. I ordered fencing, hay bins, wheelbarrows. I introduced myself to the feed store clerk and asked about rescue animals in the area. And I posted a job listing on the university's agriculture board: live-in assistant, needed for animal care, room and board included. Veterinary students encouraged to apply. That's how I met Stella. She arrived 2 weeks later with a backpack, a pair of dusty boots, and a smile so bright it startled me. 23, quick-witted, no-nonsense. She had grown up in rural Kentucky, was studying veterinary medicine part-time, and had more practical knowledge about goats and horses than most people twice her age. "I've never lived on site before," she said, glancing toward the cottage. "It's not glamorous," I warned. "I don't need glamorous," she said. "I need purpose." So did I. We scrubbed out the cottage together, painted the walls, replaced the warped flooring with secondhand laminate. It wasn't pretty, but it was clean, warm, livable. She moved into the smaller bedroom, kept a few books and her vet bag by the door, and quickly made herself indispensable. Within a week, we had 3 dogs from the county shelter, 2 retired horses from a bankrupt stable, and a pregnant goat someone had abandoned behind a grocery store. Stella took charge of the animals, I took charge of everything else. Every morning began with feedings, every afternoon with repairs. My hands cracked from labor, but I had never felt more whole. At night, I sat on the front porch with a cup of tea and watched the stars. No more muffled conversations through apartment walls. No more being told to stay quiet, stay out of the way, stay small. Here, I didn't need permission to be myself. I never told Grayson I left. I never answered his texts. I didn't return Lily's messages asking if I'd be home for dinner. I didn't owe them explanations. They had made their choices. So had I. My phone eventually stopped ringing. No one came looking. It was exactly how I wanted it, because sometimes the greatest revenge isn't yelling or slamming doors. Sometimes the loudest declaration of worth is silence. The kind of silence that comes with building something beautiful out of what was broken. I wasn't just gone from their lives. I had erased the version of myself who ever begged for space on their couch. And in her place, I was becoming someone new. Someone powerful, purposeful, and finally free. Morning on the farm didn't begin with alarms or rushed commutes. It started with the soft whinny of horses and the rhythmic clucking of chickens just outside my bedroom window. No polished hardwood floors, no whispered voices through thin apartment walls. Just open-air animals waking, and the kind of silence that wraps around you like a blanket instead of choking you like shame. I usually rose before the sun. It felt natural here, like my body had finally synced with something deeper than stress or obligation. I'd make a pot of real coffee, not instant, not microwaved, and sit on the porch of the farmhouse as the sky shifted from gray to soft gold. The fields rolled out before me, still heavy with dew, and I could see Stella already moving about near the barn boots, crunching over gravel, her braid bouncing behind her as she carried feed buckets with practiced ease. She had settled into the caretaker's cottage as if she were born to live there. She never asked questions about where I came from or why a woman my age had suddenly decided to run an animal rescue. She just showed up, got her hands dirty, and treated the animals like family, which in a way they were. By the end of our first month, we had added 2 more dogs, a trio of neglected barn cats, and another horse named Thunder. A beautiful, nervous gelding with wide eyes and scars that spoke of a past neither of us wanted to guess. He took to me slowly, letting me brush him while he chewed in silence, occasionally resting his heavy head on my shoulder, like he knew something had broken in both of us, and we were figuring out how to mend it together. I used part of the winnings to buy a used Honda Civic from a local dealership. It wasn't flashy, but it was reliable. The kind of car I could drive into town without drawing attention. I also invested in new fencing, upgraded the stalls in the barn, and added a small quarantine shed for sick or injured animals. Everything was practical, thoughtful, and paid for outright. I was finally building something of my own. Not just a place to live, but a life I could be proud of. There was a rhythm to the days now. Feedings in the early morning mucking stalls before the heat came in, repairing gates, checking vet appointments, balancing feed schedules. It was exhausting, and it was everything I hadn't known I needed. I was tired every night in the way that feels satisfying. My hands were cracked from labor. My clothes smelled like hay and animal dander. I stopped painting my nails. I stopped checking the mirror for gray hairs. I didn't need to impress anyone anymore. No husband to critique my wardrobe. No daughter-in-law watching me with polite judgment. No son offering help only when it was convenient for him. Grayson had called. Several times. At first I saw his name light up the phone screen and felt that reflexive pull. Old habits die hard. But I didn't answer. Not the first time, not the third, not the 7th. His voicemails started off casual. "Hey, just checking in." Then they turned uncertain. "Mom, everything okay?" Then pleading. "Can you please call me back? I deleted each one." Lily sent a text. "We're worried. Just let us know you're okay." I didn't reply. Because the truth was, I was okay. For the first time in a long, long time, I didn't need anyone's reassurance to believe it. This farm, these animals, this space, it wasn't just a new address. It was my reclamation. My quiet, unapologetic return to myself. Sometimes at night I'd stand in the kitchen of the old farmhouse and watch the reflection of the porch lights in the window glass. My own silhouette would look back at me and I wouldn't see a woman discarded. I'd see a woman who had survived, adapted, fought her way back from invisibility with nothing but determination and a winning ticket no one knew about. Stella once asked if I ever missed the city. Not even a little, I told her. She grinned. "Good, because these goats definitely prefer you to concrete." The work was hard, but I welcomed it. Every blister felt earned. Every ache in my lower back reminded me I wasn't idle, that I was needed by creatures who didn't care if I had a 401k or whether I made the bed perfectly. They just needed food patient safety. The same things I had needed when I sat hunched on that couch with a coffee mug full of soup and nowhere to go. Some nights I still thought of Grayson. Not with anger, though that had been there too, but with a kind of distant clarity. I saw now how long I had tried to earn his affection, how much of myself I had poured into him, into his comfort, into smoothing the path ahead of him, while letting mine grow cracked and overgrown. I had raised him to believe he deserved ease, and when that meant my discomfort, he didn't know how to respond. Maybe one day he'd learn. Maybe one day I'd want to hear his voice again. But not now. Now my days were full. My hands were full. My heart was no longer aching to be seen. It was content being full of purpose. This was my season of rebuilding. And for once I wasn't doing it for anyone else. It was a Saturday afternoon. and I was in the south pasture brushing Thunder's coat. The late summer sun had turned the air thick and golden, and the breeze carried that familiar scent of hay and dust. Thunder leaned into the brush, eyes half closed, his trust in me now steady and unshaken. I heard the engine before I saw the car. An all-too-familiar hum crunching over the gravel drive. I paused, hand still on the horse's withers, and turned my head slowly. Through the trees, the silver sedan emerged. Grayson's car. The same one he had once told me was too valuable to let me borrow for job interviews. The same one I had watched pull away from the curb the day I left his apartment without saying goodbye. I didn't move, just kept brushing Thunder, my other hand steadying his shoulder. I could feel the warmth of his body against mine, the calm strength of an animal that had been broken and rebuilt. I envied him a little. The car door opened and slammed shut. Then another, footsteps on gravel, hesitant, slower than I remembered. "Mom," came Grayson's voice, not loud but strained almost. Uncertain. I didn't turn. "Mom, I know you can hear me." Thunder flicked his ears, sensing the tension. I whispered to him a soft sound, and he relaxed. Finally, I looked up. Grayson stood near the fence line, dressed in wrinkled slacks and a button-up that hung looser than it used to. His hair was disheveled, and the exhaustion on his face was unmistakable. Beside him, Lily climbed out of the passenger side of the car. Her belly, 7 months along but was round beneath a maternity shirt that clung to her frame. She looked less polished, less composed than the Lily I had once tiptoed around. There was a U-Haul truck trailing them, half filled with boxes and furniture. The remnants of the life they had clearly just lost. I walked slowly toward the fence, Thunder trailing beside me like a loyal dog. When I reached it, I rested my arms on the top rail and met my son's eyes. "This is my home," I said quietly. "These are my animals. I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Grayson opened his mouth, then closed it again. I could see the flicker of shame, of panic. "Mom, how are you affording all this? The farm, the renovations, the car. The investigator said you bought this place outright." I didn't flinch. "I earned it. Doing what he asked. You haven't worked in 30 years. I looked straight at him. "I've been working my whole life, Grayson. I just didn't get paid for it." He ran a hand through his hair. An old, nervous habit from childhood, one that once made me feel tenderness. Now it just made me tired. "Look, I know we had some difficult conversations," he started. Before I left, I interrupted. "You didn't ask me to leave, Grayson. You threw me out." His shoulders sagged. It was complicated. "For you. For me, it was quite simple. You chose your wife's comfort over your mother's basic dignity." Lily walked up slowly, resting one hand on her back. She looked around the property. At the barn, the fencing, the evidence of my new life. Mom, Grayson said again, softer this time, "We need help." I said nothing, just waited. "We lost the apartment. The bank called the loan. We don't have anywhere else to go." Lily stepped closer. "Think of your grandson," she said quietly, resting her hand on her stomach. "Please." I looked at them both. My son, who had told me I was temporary. His wife, who had called me Caroline in my own son's kitchen. Now they stood here, disheveled, desperate, vulnerable. I turned and looked up toward the cottage. Stella stood on the porch, arms crossed, watching. She didn't say a word, but I could see the curiosity. And maybe a flicker of satisfaction in her expression. "Stella," I called, "would you mind showing our guests to their accommodations?" Grayson's brows furrowed. "Accommodations?" "The caretaker's cottage," I said. "It's not glamorous, but it has plumbing, electricity, and a roof." Lily blinked. "Wait, you mean we'll be staying there? You were expecting the main house." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Her silence was louder than any complaint. Grayson took a deep breath. "Mom, we're grateful for anything." I nodded. "Good. Come, let me show you around." The cottage looked smaller than usual, with the two of them standing in it. Their belongings crowded the living room, which barely fit the old thrift store couch and the second-hand table Stella had refinished. "It has everything you need," I said. "Running water, heat, and a working stove, the basics." Lily trailed her hand along the worn countertop. "It's cozy." "There are house rules," I continued. "No loud music after 9. No guests without asking. No alcohol on the property. Some of the animals are sensitive, and everyone contributes to the work." Grayson looked up sharply. "Work? This is a working farm. We rise at 5. Feeding starts at dawn. If Lily isn't able to help because of the pregnancy, you'll take on double—" Lily's face went pale. "We're not— Mom, this is— You have nowhere else to go," I said calmly. "And this is what I'm offering." Grayson nodded slowly. "Okay, we'll make it work." I turned to leave. "Good. The work starts tomorrow. Stella will show you the routine." As I walked back toward the house, I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I already knew they were staring at the peeling paint, the cramped space, the new reality they had stepped into. The same space I had once begged them for. And been denied. Only now the rules were mine. By 5 o'clock the next morning, the sky was still dark and the air damp with dew. The farm was quiet, save for the occasional stomp of a horse in the barn and the distant hoot of an owl settling in for sleep. I was already up sipping hot coffee on the porch when I saw Stella making her way toward the cottage. She didn't knock. She just let herself in like we'd agreed. 5 minutes later, I watched through the kitchen window as she re-emerged with Grayson trailing behind her, half awake, pulling on a hoodie. Lily came out more slowly, one hand on her lower back, her other gripping a metal water bottle. Her face was already drawn with fatigue. The morning light started to break as Stella handed Grayson a pitchfork and pointed toward the stalls. "First things first," she said, not unkindly. "You muck the stalls before the animals eat, otherwise they lie in it and we get infections." "Ever cleaned out a stall before?" Grayson blinked. "Not exactly." Stella raised an eyebrow. "Well, no better time to learn." I stayed inside for a while, watching from the window. There was something strangely calming about it. Not satisfaction exactly, but clarity. This wasn't vengeance. It wasn't about making them suffer. It was about giving them the one thing they'd always seemed to lack when dealing with me perspective. Grayson fumbled with the pitchfork, grimacing at the smell, but he didn't complain. Not out loud, at least. Stella corrected his grip, showed him how to lift with his knees, not his back, and moved on to the next stall with practiced speed. Lily stayed outside the barn, wiping her forehead every few minutes. Her breathing labored from the heat and her pregnancy. Stella tossed her a folding chair. "You'll help with water buckets." And no standing too long. By the time breakfast rolled around, Grayson's shirt was soaked through with sweat, and Lily looked like she might cry. We ate at the small table in the main house kitchen. I offered oatmeal fruit and black coffee. No one talked much. Grayson rubbed his shoulder and stared into his bowl. Lily kept checking her phone even though there was barely any signal out here. After they left, I cleared the table in silence. They didn't say thank you, but I didn't expect them to. Not yet. Gratitude is something you learn the hard way. Over the next several days, Stella walked them through every task. Feeding the goats, hauling hay, inspecting fencing for weak spots. She was patient, but firm. When Grayson struggled to carry a 50-pound feed bag, she didn't offer to help. She stood back and let him figure it out. "It's not supposed to be easy," she said one morning. "It's supposed to be worth it." Lily began doing small tasks. Scooping grain, keeping inventory, cleaning water troughs. She moved slower than usual, her pregnancy catching up to her. But she didn't stop trying. Not entirely. One evening, I stopped by the cottage with clean linens and a small batch of muffins I'd baked with the last of our blueberries. The place was a mess. Boxes half unpacked, their oversized furniture crammed into spaces too small to accommodate them. Lily sat on the couch with her feet propped up, rubbing her temples. "This isn't living," she muttered. "This is punishment." I set the linens down on the counter and turned to her calmly. I call it opportunity. She looked at me then, startled. Opportunity for what? To break our backs. To feel small. No, I said, meeting her eyes. To rebuild. To understand what it means to start from the bottom and work your way up with dignity. She shook her head. You think we deserve this? I think you're learning something most people don't until much later. If at all. She fell quiet after that. I didn't stay long. I wasn't there to argue and I wasn't there to soothe. Grayson, meanwhile, was changing in ways he didn't realize. He stopped flinching at the smell of manure. He asked Stella questions about fencing knots, about water lines, about the cost of feed per animal. He was learning with his hands, not just his mouth. For a man who once worked behind a polished desk and judged value by expense reports, this was a different education. Still, there were moments of resistance. One afternoon, after Stella asked him to clear debris from the west pasture, he walked into the house and slammed a cup onto the counter. This is ridiculous. I have a degree. I had a career. I shouldn't be hauling garbage like a day laborer. I looked up from the book I was reading. You had a career. You don't now. And this isn't garbage. This is the work that keeps animals alive. He stood there, his chest rising and falling, trying to summon some retort, some old defense. But there was nothing left to say. He turned and walked out. That night he didn't join us for dinner. Lily did, though. She sat across from me at the table, eating quietly, then pushed her plate back and looked me in the eye. I used to think you were fragile, she said slowly. Too soft. Not assertive enough. I didn't think you had boundaries. And now I asked. Now I know you were just tired of explaining yourself to people who had already made up their minds. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The next morning I saw them both up before the sun. No complaining, no sulking. Grayson fed the horses with quiet focus. Lily helped Stella stack hay. The work had stopped being about consequence and started becoming about contribution. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about them finally stepping into the lessons life had offered. Lessons I'd once tried to teach gently only to be dismissed. Now the farm was doing what I no longer had the energy to do myself. It was teaching them humility. And in return, they were beginning to show signs of something new, respect, maybe even gratitude. I watched from the porch that evening, wrapped in a light shawl as the sun dipped behind the trees. Grayson was fixing a section of loose fencing, sweat on his brow shirt, stained hands blistered. Lily walked slowly beside him, offering a bottle of water, her free hand resting on her belly. They didn't see me watching, and I didn't need them to. It was still dark when Stella's urgent knock came at my door. I was already awake, as I often was these days, sipping coffee and listening to the soft sounds of the barn coming alive. But her knock, sharp and fast, told me something was wrong. I opened the door and she didn't hesitate. "It's Lily," she said. "Her water just broke. It's early. She's in pain." Without thinking, I grabbed my keys, a quilt, and the emergency bag I'd quietly packed weeks ago. Not because they asked me to, but because some instincts never leave you even after everything. Stella helped Lily into the car. Grayson stood by, panicked and useless, his hands hovering, unsure of what to do. His face was pale eyes, wild. I took one look at him and said firmly, "You're riding in back. Stella's driving." He didn't argue. They sped down the gravel road toward the hospital. I followed in the old Honda, the quilt in the passenger seat, along with a thermos of soup and a tin of crackers I had grabbed on instinct. Something warm. Something real. I arrived just behind them. The hospital staff rushed Lily into labor and delivery. Stella stayed at her side, calm as ever, helping with intake paperwork and rubbing her back through contractions. I waited in the hall, the quilt clutched in my arms like an anchor. 2 hours later, the nurse came out. "It's a boy," she said. "He's early but strong, healthy. They're both doing well." I closed my eyes for a second. Just 1 second. Then I nodded and asked if I could see them. The nurse led me to a small recovery room. Lily was lying in bed, pale but alert, holding a swaddled bundle. Grayson sat beside her, his face still stunned, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened. When they saw me, no one spoke. I crossed the room slowly, set the quilt down at the foot of the bed, and handed over the thermos and the crackers. Lily looked at them, then at me. "Thank you," she whispered. I nodded. "His name, Miles Grayson," said. "We named him Miles. I didn't ask why. I didn't ask for explanations. I just stood there watching my grandson breathe, his tiny chest rising and falling like a miracle. For all the things that had gone wrong, this was something that had gone right. I didn't stay long. I wasn't invited to. But as I turned to go, Lily reached out and touched my hand. Just briefly. Not a grasp, not a grip. Just contact. Human and soft. "Thank you," she said again, more firmly this time. Her voice cracked around the edges. I left the hospital and drove back to the farm in silence. The sky was beginning to lighten and the fields shimmered with early morning mist. I parked the car, walked to the porch, and sat down with a new cup of coffee, waiting for the world to start again. Over the next few weeks, things shifted. Not dramatically, but undeniably. Grayson returned to the chores without being asked. His hands, once soft and unused to real labor, had begun to harden. Blisters turned to calluses. He moved with intention now, not reluctance. He didn't talk much. But I noticed the way he wiped down tools after using them, the way he double-checked fence latches, the way he stopped grumbling when Stella corrected him. Lily, recovering at the cottage, began to keep a notebook. She tracked feed quantities, medication schedules, vet appointments. She asked Stella questions about budgeting for new supplies, about vaccinations and deworming cycles. She even offered to help me sort through receipts one afternoon, her tone cautious, respectful. There were no grand apologies, no confessions. But the air between us had changed. One evening I brought over a casserole, nothing fancy, just comfort food. Lily opened the door, holding Miles against her shoulder. Her hair was unbrushed, her shirt stained with formula, but her eyes were warm in a way I hadn't seen before. "He's fussy today," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "Wants to be held all the time." I handed her the dish and gently reached out to touch his tiny hand. His fingers curled around mine with surprising strength. I looked at him for a long moment, then said, "That means he knows who's safe." Lily swallowed. I didn't know how much it meant. To be safe. Until now. I nodded. None of us do. Until we lose it. She looked down at her son, and I saw it in her. Guilt, maybe, but also something quieter. Humility. Later, I stepped outside to find Grayson unloading hay from the truck. He saw me and straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "Need help?" I asked. "No," he said. "Got it." But he didn't look away. "Thank you. For being there. For Lily. For the baby." I met his eyes, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't see the boy who had once pushed me aside. I saw a man learning how to carry weight, literal and emotional. "I was always there," I said softly. "You just weren't looking." He nodded once, then went back to his work. I walked back to the main house slowly, the evening sun casting long shadows across the porch. Inside, I sat down with my ledgers, my lists, my growing vision for the rescue. I still hadn't forgiven them. Not fully, but something had cracked open. And maybe, just maybe, what came through that crack wasn't anger anymore. Maybe it was grace. Not the soft kind that excuses everything, but the kind that acknowledges how far someone has come, even if they still have a long way to go. It was early spring when Lily showed up at my kitchen door with a manila folder in her hands and a look of quiet resolve on her face. The air outside still carried a chill, but the sun had begun warming the fields in patches, and I had just finished washing up after the morning feed. I didn't expect anyone that day, least of all her. She knocked softly, then stepped just inside the frame when I opened the door. "Good morning, Martha," she said, her voice steadier than usual. I nodded and stepped aside. "Come in." She glanced around the kitchen, taking in the tidy counters and the quiet hum of the old refrigerator. Her eyes paused on the coffee pot, and for a moment I thought she might ask for a cup. But she didn't. Instead, she moved to the table and laid the folder in front of her with both hands. "I was hoping we could talk," she said. I sat down across from her. "I'm listening." Lily took a deep breath. "I've been working on the rescue's finances, organizing receipts, tracking expenses, projecting costs through the end of the year. I think I've got a decent handle on it now." I nodded, waiting. She opened the folder and slid a few pages across the table. Spreadsheets, graphs, tidy columns of numbers in a neat hand. "There's room to grow. Donations have picked up, the adoption rate is solid. With some planning and grant research, we could scale this into something bigger." I looked down at the papers. She'd marked out ways to save on feed transportation, even long-term veterinary care. I didn't say anything at first. I just scanned the sheets while she watched me with cautious eyes. Then she pulled out one last document, a formal letter neatly typed with signatures and legal language at the bottom. "This is a proposal," she said, "from Grayson and me. We'd like to stay, but not as family asking for favors. As employees, as managers." I looked up. "We want to contribute officially," she continued, "to be responsible for the daily operations. Animal care finances repairs. We'd live in the cottage. In exchange for salaries and housing, we want to earn our place here." For a long moment, neither of us said anything. The silence between us wasn't hostile. It was heavy, with history, with missteps, with the fragile possibility of something new. I folded my hands and leaned back in my chair. "You've come a long way," I said. "We've tried," she replied. "We're still trying." I tapped the document lightly. "You're asking for structure, for permanence." "Yes." I closed the folder and met her gaze fully. "I'll agree to this," I said. "But there's one condition." She nodded. "Of course. If I ever feel invisible again, if I'm ever treated like I don't matter in my own home, this ends. No explanations, no negotiations." Her breath caught. "Understood." I held her eyes for a moment longer, searching for any trace of the woman who once called me by my first name as if I were the housekeeper. But that woman wasn't sitting in front of me now. This version of Lily was quieter, humbler, still guarded, but changed. "Are we clear?" I asked. "Crystal," she said. I reached over, took the pen she had brought, and signed the document with deliberate strokes. She let out a small exhale. Not relief exactly. Something more like recognition. Like she understood just how much that signature cost me. The next morning, Grayson joined me at the edge of the south pasture, carrying a clipboard and a bucket of nails. He didn't say much, just gestured toward the fencing we needed to reinforce before spring rains turned the ground to mud. We worked side by side in silence, hammering stakes, and checking the wire, the sun warming our backs. At one point, he paused and looked over the field. "This is a good place," he said. I didn't respond. A few minutes later, he added, "Lily told me about the agreement." I nodded. "She handled it well." He hesitated, then said, "Thank you for giving us the chance." "You're not being given anything," I replied. "You're earning it." He smiled faintly. "Fair enough." That was all. But it was enough. Days passed. The rhythm of the farm continued steady and grounding. I watched from the porch as Lily rocked Miles in the shade, whispering softly to him between chores. I watched as Grayson repaired a broken gutter without being asked. They were no longer tentative visitors. They were becoming stewards. I still kept some distance. I didn't attend dinner in the cottage. I didn't join in every planning conversation. Not out of resentment, but because space was still important. Rebuilding trust wasn't about erasing boundaries. It was about respecting them. Stella, ever observant, noticed the shift. "They're different," she said one evening as we fed the horses. "Both of them." "They're learning," I replied. She glanced at me sideways. So are you. I didn't deny it, because she was right. Forgiveness, I had learned, isn't a switch you flip. It's a slow process of remembering that people can change and deciding every day whether or not you'll meet them there. That evening, I stood at the kitchen window looking out over the pasture. The sun dipped behind the trees, casting long golden streaks across the fields. The animals were quiet, the barn secure, and the only sounds were of crickets beginning their nighttime chorus. For the first time in months, I felt something unexpected. Hope. Not because everything was fixed, but because for the first time it wasn't all on my shoulders, and that more than anything felt like healing. The days grew longer and spring settled in like an old friend. The pasture turned a deeper green, the fences held strong under fresh repairs, and the rhythm of the farm found its way into all of us. We weren't just surviving anymore, we were building something. One morning, as I was refilling water troughs near the barn, Grayson walked up holding a clipboard. His boots were worn in now, and the cuffs of his jeans were dusted with straw. He looked more like a man who belonged here than the buttoned-up figure who once watched me from behind a kitchen island. "I've been thinking," he said, clearing his throat. I glanced over. "Dangerous habit?" He smiled. Not the strained kind I used to get. This one was easy familiar. "I've been keeping track of a few nearby farm closures," he continued. "Some are being auctioned off in pieces. There's talk of 3 or 4 cows being sold for almost nothing because no one wants to transport them. Some goats, too. Even a couple of donkeys." I waited. He looked down at the clipboard. "I was thinking we could take them in. Expand the program. Rescue more livestock, maybe even try for a small grant from the Agriculture Board. I've started drafting a plan. Costs, materials, timelines. I just need your thoughts." I took the clipboard and skimmed through his notes. They were detailed. He'd factored in transport, feed, fencing, even a basic medical fund. There were numbers in the margins scrawled in Lily's handwriting. She'd obviously gone through it with him. "This is good work," I said. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "You think it's doable?" I handed the clipboard back. "With effort and commitment, you'll have it," he said. "From both of us." Later that week, Lily asked if I had a few minutes to go over budgets. She had cleared off the kitchen table, laid out spreadsheets and expense logs, and was sitting with a cup of tea and a calculator. "I've tightened up our feed supplier costs," she said as I sat beside her. "And I think we can start applying for donations from a few local charities. Animal welfare groups, sustainable farming initiatives. If we position the rescue as both a service and a teaching tool, we might even qualify for educational funding." I looked at her. Truly looked at her. There was a steadiness in her voice, a focus that had nothing to do with appearances or impressing anyone. She wasn't playing house. She was running one. A rough, dirt-covered, animal-filled house, but a house nonetheless. "You're good at this," I said. She smiled a little. "I forgot I was... Before marketing, I actually studied accounting." "Why'd you change?" she shrugged. "Didn't think it was interesting. Thought I wanted to do something more exciting. Turns out building something real is more satisfying than selling it." It was quiet for a moment. Then she added, "Also, I like having a place that doesn't expect perfection. Just honesty." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. She wasn't saying it for approval. She was saying it because it was finally true. That weekend, I watched Grayson shovel out Thunder's stall with practiced rhythm. He whistled softly under his breath, pausing now and then to talk to the horse like he was an old friend. Miles sat nearby in a portable bassinet, kicking his legs gently, his eyes tracking the movement of his father. When the stall was clean, Grayson leaned down, wiped his hands on a rag, and crouched beside the bassinet. "You see that, buddy?" he said, brushing a bit of hay from the baby's blanket. "That's how you earn your keep around here. One day I'll teach you. But for now, you just keep napping." His voice was gentle, not performative, not rehearsed. It was the voice of a man who had begun to understand what it meant to stay, to show up, to hold something fragile and treat it like it matters. From the porch, I watched the scene unfold, my hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. The air smelled like grass and horses and spring. For a moment, I simply stood there, taking it all in, and I smiled. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't. The plumbing still made noise, the cottage still needed paint, and the goat named Buttons still escaped her pen every other day. But it was working. Grayson no longer asked for praise. He simply did the work. He listened when Stella explained vaccination protocols. He asked for advice before making changes. He held Miles every chance he got. I often caught him walking the baby around the property, pointing out the barn, the fields, even the compost pile, narrating everything with surprising tenderness. Lily continued to track finances, coordinate vet appointments, and update our social media page with stories of the animals we'd saved. She didn't ask for recognition, and she didn't try to reclaim some lost image of herself. She was grounded now, present. And Miles. He grew stronger every day. His laugh had started to emerge, a gurgling little sound that made even Stella pause to smile when she was ankle-deep in mud. One afternoon, while we were all finishing up evening chores, Lily came out of the cottage holding Miles against her hip. She waved at Grayson, who was loading hay into the barn, then walked over to me. "He's growing fast," I said. She nodded. "And watching everything?" "You can almost see him taking it in." I looked at her, then at the baby. His tiny hands clenched and unclenched, his eyes wide and curious. "He'll learn what he sees," I said. "That's how boys become men." Lily looked down at her son. "Then I hope we're showing him something worth becoming." I didn't answer. Because maybe, just maybe, we were... Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, I stood alone in the kitchen. The windows were dark, the house quiet. I poured a glass of water, looked out across the fields, and saw the faint glow of a lantern near the barn. Grayson was walking the fence line, double-checking the locks like we'd taught him, making sure everything was secure before turning in for the night. He didn't know I was watching. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to. Because some things, some people, finally learn what it means to show up without being asked. And when that happens, you don't have to chase love or demand respect. You just have to let it grow. It was late afternoon when Lily knocked gently on the screen door. I was at the kitchen table sorting through feed invoices and donation letters, the soft creak of the porch boards beneath her feet already telling me who it was. Her knock was careful, not tentative, but thoughtful, like she didn't want to disturb, only to ask permission. I looked up and nodded. "Come in." She stepped inside, holding a folder against her chest like a shield. Her hair was braided back, her sleeves rolled, and her hands bore the same dry lines mine once did when I was her age. Signs of work, not weakness. "I was hoping we could talk," she said quietly. I motioned to the table. "Sit." She placed the folder down but didn't open it. Instead, she took a breath and folded her hands in her lap. "I've been thinking," she started, "about all the things I said to you, or didn't say, about how I treated you when you first came to live with us." I didn't respond. I wanted her to keep going, not for my sake, but for hers. "I was wrong," she continued. "Not just in how I spoke to you, but in what I assumed. I thought I understood what strength looked like. I thought it meant control and order, but I've watched you since we came here, and I realize now that real strength is quiet. It's patient. It endures." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly. "I was unkind to you. I made you feel like you didn't belong. And the truth is, I was scared. Scared of what you reminded me of what it might mean to need someone the way you once needed us." I let that sit between us for a moment, like dust settling in the still air. "I appreciate you saying that," I said. "There's something else," she added, her voice softening. "Grayson, he doesn't say it out loud, not often. But every night when he puts Miles to sleep, he tells him stories. About the farm, about animals, and always about you. I blinked, surprised. "He calls you the strongest person he knows," she said. "Says he hopes Miles grows up to be like you. He just doesn't know how to say it to your face." I looked down at the invoices in front of me, then gently set them aside. There are moments in life when words, even carefully spoken ones, don't feel like enough, but they still carry weight. This was one of them. "I don't need him to say it," I replied. "I see it. In how he works. In how he shows up." Lily nodded slowly. "I just wanted you to know. In case you ever wondered." There was a silence after that. Not uncomfortable, but real. She opened the folder finally and pulled out a form. "One more thing. It's a new operations plan. Just outlined some ideas we've had for expansion and sustainability. Nothing major. Yet. But I want your eyes on it. Your approval." I smiled faintly. "You're not looking for permission, Lily. You're looking for partnership." She smiled back. "Maybe both." I stood and walked to the window. Outside, Stella was sitting under the oak tree, gently rocking Miles in her arms, his tiny head tucked under her chin. A few yards away, Grayson was bent over the edge of the pasture, adjusting the latch on a new gate he'd installed last week. His movements were deliberate, practiced. And at the edge of the porch, Lily's notebook sat open on the bench, her handwriting neatly filling the pages with feed schedules and task lists. "You've both come a long way," I said. "We're trying," she replied. "Every day." I turned back to her and placed my hand on the table, not reaching out, just grounding myself. "You can stay," I said, "as long as you keep living by the values you've found here. Gratitude, accountability, integrity." She nodded, eyes glistening. "But if you ever make me feel invisible again," I added gently but firmly, "if I ever become someone you only notice when it's convenient or easy, then this arrangement ends. No warnings, no discussions." "Understood," she whispered. "Completely." I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not the young woman who once treated me like an inconvenience, but a mother, a partner, a woman who had been humbled by life and was choosing to rise anyway. We stood together for a moment, before she quietly left the kitchen, the screen door clicking softly behind her. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low behind the barn, I took my seat on the porch with a cup of tea and a light shawl draped over my shoulders. The air was warm but breezy, and the smell of hay and blooming clover drifted in from the pasture. From where I sat, I could see it all. Stella swaying gently with Miles humming something quiet and sweet. Grayson tightening the final bolts on the gate, standing back to check his work with quiet pride. Lily at the picnic table, calculator in hand, jotting figures into her ledger while the last rays of sunlight caught the edge of her notebook. No one was performing. No one was pretending. This was life not curated, but lived. Built not from perfection, but from hard-earned effort, humility, and a willingness to grow. And in that moment I felt something settle in my chest. Not just peace, but contentment. The kind that comes from knowing you didn't have to destroy anyone to rebuild yourself. That dignity could be reclaimed quietly, and that healing didn't always need a spotlight. Sometimes it just needed room to breathe. This I thought as I watched them. This is family. Not because we share blood, but because we chose each other again. Chose to do better, to show up, to say less, and prove more. A family born not of duty or guilt, but of gratitude and growth. And I wouldn't have it any other way. If you've ever felt overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel like a burden by the very people you once sacrificed everything for, then perhaps Caroline's story speaks to something deep inside you. Have you ever been told you should just accept it when all you wanted was respect? Have you ever had to rebuild your worth, not with anger, but with quiet strength? If her journey reminded you of your own, or of someone you love, we invite you to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story might inspire someone else. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, about silent resilience, quiet justice, and the kind of love that refuses to be erased. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Click the bell so you never miss a moment of healing hope and hard-won dignity. Thank you for listening. You're not alone.